Então, sem mais delongas, passar a palavra para o EricWiebelhaus-Brahm, PhD em Ciência Política pela Universidade do Colorado, Estados Unidos. Atualmente atua como consultor independente em matérias de reconstrução pós-conflito, bem como em emprego e políticas de Estado de bem-estar social junto a Hewitt Associates. Por favor.
Thank you to Professor Pinheiro for the invitation to participate. And thank you to the organizers and the sponsors for making it possible for me to be here. And my apologies for not being able to talk to you in Portuguese. But I hope in the few minutes that I have with you that I'd like to talk about what some other countries have experienced as a result of truth commissions. What sort of impact have these investigations had? It's a tricky question to ask, and so it's one that I'll at best be able to offer tentative conclusions on. I think, first of all, it bears repeating some things that Priscilla mentioned this morning in the fact that in many respects Brazil is unique amongst many countries that have transitioned to democracy over the past 30 years or so. It has been increasingly common to incorporate some form of transitional justice. And again, in many instances, a truth commission is something that comes out of transitional negotiations. And it often is created right at the transitional period, which is obviously not something that will happen with Brazil. There have been significant steps that have already been taken, with some archives being opened, reparations programs being established for some survivors. And so all of that is to say is that there's a significant passage of time between the military era and today when we're talking about creating a truth commission in Brazil. A second issue is that by comparison to many other countries that have created truth commissions, military era in Brazil was comparatively mild. I don't mean to say that to discount the suffering of victims and survivors, but if one wants to look at sheer numbers, the number of individuals killed, for example, is much lower here than elsewhere, which is a crude way of thinking about it, but that has implications in terms of what or how a commission might work and what it might be able to produce. So clearly, despite that scenario and the fact that Brazil's experience has not followed a typical path, I mean, there clearly is significant demand, to look at the military era. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Clearly, there's significant information that remains missing that survivors would like to get, and that, as Eduardo pointed out, that Brazil as a society should have. Perpetrators remain unpunished, and so there's clearly, clearly this discussion is an important one. Looking at Truth Commission experiences around the world, they've had a whole range of potential areas of potential impact, or of what consequence these investigations might be. On a basic level, they want to produce information. And we've talked about that, or others have talked about that earlier, and I'll say a few words about that. Second, there is often a hope that the investigation will help to promote accountability for past human rights abuses. Third, increasingly, truth commissions are thought of as a way to provide a venue in which victims can tell their stories and have it officially acknowledged. There's an element in which the investigation can contribute to public education and debate about the past, as Eduardo had mentioned. They typically produce recommendations that might be for further redress, for suffering, or for reforms that are designed to prevent these abuses from happening again in the future. They're often the goal is to promote democratic consolidation. And finally, to promote reconciliation, whether it's at the individual level between perpetrator and victim, or survivor, if you will, or on an intergroup level to try to repair relationships between former opposing groups. So, in talking, again, to reiterate, in talking about the role of impact, many of the claims about what sort of effects these investigations have rest on shaky empirical and logical foundations. And secondly, to reiterate that Brazil really differs in significant ways from many other transitional societies. Again, their truth commissions typically shortly follow a democratic transition. They've typically been created in poor countries, some of the world's poorest countries, where there's limited resources and very basic development needs that need to be made. That is not the case here in Brazil. And then again, the truth commissions are often the first or the only form of transitional justice that is created in many countries, and that again is not the case in Brazil. So, in the remaining minutes that I have, I want to talk a little bit about 5 types of ends that truth commissions have had: uncovering information, promoting human rights, strengthening democracy, encouraging and promoting the well-being of victims, and promoting reconciliation. And think about how they might apply and what Brazil might be able to expect. Again, I guess to preview my conclusions, Brazilians shouldn't expect too much. There's often a lot expected of truth commissions. And there actually may be some compromises that might be necessary in order to achieve some of these goals. But nonetheless, certainly in my view, and I think many of us in the room, this certainly is a positive development, should a truth commission be created. So on a basic level, truth commissions are designed to uncover truth, to uncover information about the past. And that's an important end in its own right. And more than that, pretty much all of the other areas of impact that I'm going to talk about later in the talk are predicated on that ability to produce information and to produce a credible account about past violence. Now, for reasons that Eduardo elaborated, the truth that's produced is often limited. There's limitations in the mandate that make it impossible to uncover the details about every particular crime. There's limitations in terms of resources that are available for investigation. There's the problem of non-cooperation amongst governments and militaries. And there's also the passage of time, which leads to evidence being eroded, witnesses passing away, or in other ways being unavailable to contribute. Now, certainly Brazil, through various mechanisms such as the Brazil Nunca Mais, some of the archives that have been opened, the special commission's work, have produced some amount of information. And in some sense, the most readily available information and the most easily accessible information, much of it is already out there. And so what still needs to be uncovered is really some of the tougher information to be able to get at. And so that leads me to wonder what might be necessary in order to get at more of the information which is not currently available. It seems to me that it would require at least one or two possible steps. One is for the government to become much more forceful with the military in pushing any remaining archives to be uncovered and made available for a commission to be investigated. And as Eduardo pointed out, many other truth commissions have on paper had strong powers in order to obtain this information, but have not received cooperation in order to obtain them. So that's one thing that might be necessary. A second step that might help to produce more information is to consider offering some sort of more durable amnesty or even a use immunity for individuals who may have information. Now, some other truth commissions have offered those kinds of possibilities to people to come forward and provide testimony about what they know. And currently, there is the amnesty in place here in Brazil, which minimizes an incentive for some to do so. But as depending on what happens with the court cases currently going on, that may change. To move on to talking about human rights, what sort of effects do some of these commissions have in terms of promoting human rights? And I think about that in both, in two senses. One is more of a backward-looking sense in terms of promoting additional areas of accountability. Some commissions have, in a very indirect sense, contributed to future prosecutions by uncovering information that might have, that in some cases, such as Peru and Uganda and Argentina, have been turned over to prosecutors. Then it's obviously in their hands in terms of whether and how that information is used. Second thing that sometimes follows from truth commissions is that there are vetting procedures that are sometimes put in place to screen individuals who have been identified by commissions and to remove them from office. Liberia recently recommended that many individuals, including the current president, be removed from power because of their involvement in the civil war. And that's unleashed a tremendous amount of controversy there. Some commissions have often recommended reparations in forms of memorialization, which there's been a start of that in Brazil, but provided more information comes out about more cases, it might be a possibility. To talk more about forward-looking issues in terms of prevention of future human rights abuses, commissions typically make recommendations, some of which in the mandate are listed, in the commission's mandate are listed as being mandatory. But it's important to remember that truth commissions are temporary bodies, and so after they finish their reports, they dissolve, and so it's left to other institutions. Sometimes there are follow-up bodies that are created. Sometimes it relies on political will of politicians, civil society groups, and survivors groups in order to continue to promote pressure for these recommendations to be enacted. There have been some successes. In some cases, there have been judicial reforms, reorganizations of the armed forces, changes in terms of training, but I don't want to overstate it, that it's been relatively rare. Recommendations more often than not have not been implemented. And so one of the things that's important in terms of thinking about the long-term effect is what might Brazil do at the end, what might many of you in this room about doing in terms of hoping to encourage that some of the recommendations that come forward be implemented. And mainly the same, when we're talking about promoting democratization, many of the same issues apply. If we're talking on an institutional dimension, if many commissions recommend reforms to promote the independence of the judiciary and to help promote the judiciary as a more effective protector of the rule of law and a counterweight to other branches of government. And again, the implementation record is a bit spotty. if we want to talk about victim well-being, increasingly truth commissions do pay attention to wanting to provide a comfortable setting for victims to tell their stories and to have it officially acknowledged. But whether or not that the experience of coming before a truth commission is healing is really a difficult question to answer. And frankly, individuals have very different reactions to the experience. In South Africa and Sierra Leone, for example, victims were often dissatisfied with their respective truth commissions because of the lack of timely reparations that followed up their participation. Whereas at the same time, individuals who were perpetrators who were being demobilized were gaining benefits immediately. Nonetheless, in South Africa, for example, a survey of individuals found that most of them would want to be part of the process again, even if they knew the pain that would result of having participated in the process. They would still have made the same choice to participate and to testify. More hopefully, a survey in Ghana found that most victims felt that the National Reconciliation Commission there gave them a sense of relief. And for some, they even felt a sense of reconciliation. A similar situation was true in East Timor, though I should say that there are other studies that do suggest that the experience of giving evidence led to re-traumatization. I guess a final point in terms of victims is that truth commissions have almost universally paid insufficient attention to providing follow-up services to victims, whether it's counseling, medical care, and that's actually something that Brazil comparatively is in a good position to provide. There are more resources available here in that regard than there are in most post-conflict situations. And lastly, I'll talk very briefly about reconciliation precisely, in many respects, because it is such a difficult concept to define. Following many truth commissions, if one wants to take Chile and Argentina, for example, after their respective truth commissions, there still remained a significant reluctance to talk about the past, and when it was brought up, old tensions often reemerged. And it was only the passage of a significant number of years, which we'll hear about in the next panel, has that begun to change. In South Africa, there's mixed survey evidence that in some respects, South Africans thought that the process was detrimental to victims. And the past at times has been used by the ANC for political ends. But it bears keeping in mind, too, that survey results, for example, are fleeting. They're dependent on feelings at a particular point in time and political events at a particular point in time. And so these perceptions are volatile, and so making really any causal argument is difficult. And so I think to wrap up, I think on balance, Brazil, I think, has much to gain from a truth commission. Uncovering additional information about past abuses meets a key need for many victims who have not been able to find out information about what happened. It serves a social dimension and educational dimension for the entire country. May help to promote accountability, which has thus far been absent. And again, to repeat, there is a relatively large amount of resources available here to conduct the investigation, which make the process a bit more manageable. In my mind, it seems to me that there are two main obstacles to being, two that come to mind for a truth commission being effective in investigating military-era abuses. First, as I mentioned earlier, some information has already emerged, and additional documents remain hidden or destroyed depending on who you believe. And so without a clear incentive amongst perpetrators and those with knowledge to come forward, or some means of compelling that information to come forward, it's not clear to me how much more will be learned from a Truth Commission. And thus far, at least from what I can see, civilian administrations have been reluctant to really directly confront the military on that point. If there is a change of heart, what Truth Commission architects, in my mind, should do is outline credible rules and procedures for collecting and preserving evidence and testimony to better ensure that they might be admissible in future court cases, for example, or for other uses. If the Commission is granted powers to grant amnesty or some sort of use immunity for cooperation, the criteria for doing so should be done on very strong moral and legal grounds. Lastly, I think a second obstacle, and perhaps obstacle isn't the right word, but a second issue I think to be kept in mind is contemporary crime and violence. It seems to me that it's somewhat difficult to justify examining human rights abuses from 20 to 30 years ago without looking at abuses that have happened more recently and leaving those unaddressed. And I think from what others have said earlier today and from interesting research that I've read elsewhere, there clearly is a connection and a continuity of there being a lack of accountability and a lack of addressing human rights abuses from the military era that has helped to perpetuate a culture of impunity. And so what I mean to say is that the violations are not completely unrelated from the military era and since democratization. And so while a broader investigation of human rights abuses, including those that have occurred since 1985, is really a more daunting undertaking, I think it's one that will have both broader social relevance and a greater ability to affect human rights practices in Brazil going forward. So thank you.